Welcome back to the channel. After our trips through the grit of V-Rally and the halls of GoldenEye, it's time for some high-speed soul searching. Today, we're looking at Ridge Racer 64. Now, if you're a PlayStation veteran, you probably think you know Ridge Racer. You think of Namco, Japanese arcade mastery, and Leiko Nogase. But Ridge Racer 64 is a different beast entirely. It wasn't developed in Japan. Instead, Nintendo handed the keys to one of the most legendary franchises in gaming to a US-based team, Nintendo Software Technology, or NST, based in Redmond, Washington. This was a massive gamble. In the late 90s, the rivalry between Nintendo and Sony was at a fever pitch, and Namco was effectively the face of the PlayStation's racing success. For Nintendo to secure a bespoke Ridge Racer title developed by an internal Western team was a major power move. They didn't just want a port, they wanted a greatest hits collection that would prove the N64 could handle high-speed arcade racing better than the grey box. NST took the tracks you loved from Ridge Racer and Ridge Racer Revolution, but they didn't just copy-paste them. They rebuilt them from the ground up to take advantage of the N64's unique architecture. The result was a game that felt like a bridge between the arcade's past and a much smoother, high-resolution future. Now, let's talk numbers. Running this at a native 1440p internal resolution, effectively 6 times the original pixel count, reveals exactly how NST handled the N64's hardware differently than Rare or Nintendo's own internal teams. Most N64 games suffer from what fans call the blur. This was caused by the console's hardware-level bilinear filtering, which smoothed out textures to hide pixelation but often made things look like they were underwater. In Ridge Racer 64, however, NST used a much cleaner set of assets. By pushing the resolution to 1440p, we're finally giving those filtered textures the room they need to breathe. Notice the road surface and the rock faces. There's a clarity here that simply wasn't possible on the PlayStation, where textures would shiver and warp due to a lack of subpixel precision. Because the N64 has a much more robust Z buffer than the PS1, the geometry here is rock solid. There is zero polygon jitter. When you're drifting at 200 miles per hour, the world stays perfectly glued together. And then there's the frame rate. While the original hardware could be a bit moody, our 60 frames per second capture turns this into a surgical driving experience. It transforms the N64's smooth but slow reputation into something that feels like an early Dreamcast title. This isn't just an upscale, it's a revelation of the mathematical precision NST put into every corner. So, we've established that it looks incredible, but what's actually on the cartridge? This is where Ridge Racer 64 truly flexes on its predecessors. Most racing games of the era gave you 3 or 4 tracks and called it a day. NST, however, managed to cram the entire track lists from both the original Ridge Racer and Ridge Racer Revolution onto this one tiny cartridge. But they didn't stop at the legacy stuff. They added a 3rd set of tracks, the Renegade stages, which were exclusive to the N64. In 1440p, these new tracks show off even more technical ambition, with more complex geometry and tighter, more technical corners that were designed specifically with the N64's analog stick in mind. And speaking of that stick, we have to talk about the Revolution in Control. On the PlayStation, Ridge Racer was a digital game. You tapped the D-pad, you initiated a kind of drift, and you corrected. It was rhythmic, but it wasn't fluid. Ridge Racer 64 changed the DNA of the series by introducing true 360-degree analog steering. This wasn't just a comfort feature, it fundamentally changed how you initiate a drift. You can actually lean into the corners now, adjusting your angle mid-slide with a level of precision that PlayStation owners wouldn't see until years later. In our 60 frames per second footage, watch the front wheels of the car, you can see the granular steering in action. It's the moment Ridge Racer stopped feeling like an arcade puzzle and started feeling like a genuine driving simulation. Of course, it wouldn't be Ridge Racer without the music. But since this was an NST production, the legendary Namco sound team wasn't at the helm. Instead, the score was composed by Keith Aram and the team at PCB Productions. It trades the frantic, 90s Japanese rave vibe of the originals for a heavier, more industrial Western big beat sound. On a technical level, getting high-quality audio out of an N64 cartridge was always a struggle compared to the CD audio of the PlayStation. But NST used a sophisticated ADPCM compression that keeps the track sounding crisp and punchy, even with the engine noise screaming over the top. So, it had the tech, the tracks, and the controls, but how did it actually land back in the year 2000? To understand the reception of Ridge Racer 64, you have to look at the calendar. It released just months before the PlayStation 2 changed the world forever. At the time, critics were flawed. IGN and GameSpot both gave it massive scores, with most reviewers pointing out that it was technically superior to Ridge Racer Type 4 in terms of raw performance and stability. It was praised for being the most complete package in the series. But there was a catch. Because it was a Western Ridge Racer, some purists felt it lacked that specific Namco soul. The UI was different, the announcer was more aggressive, and that industrial soundtrack we talked about was a far cry from the J-pop energy of the originals. It became a bit of a cult classic, the Ridge Racer, for people who loved the N64's precision over the PlayStation's aesthetic. In our 1440p footage, you can see exactly what those reviewers were raving about: the absence of pop-in, the rock-solid frame rate, and a sense of speed that its rivals, like World Driver Championship, just couldn't match. If we're going to spend 13 minutes on Ridge Racer 64, we have to talk about this feel. In the racing world, there's a massive divide between sim and arcade, but Ridge Racer created its own third category, the Rhythm Racer. On the N64, the physics engine had a much higher tick rate than the PlayStation versions. This means the game is calculating the friction of your tires more frequently per second. In 1440p, you can actually see the result of this math. Notice the way the car settles after a high-speed drift. On the PS1, this was often a jittery, frame-skipping transition. Here, it's a smooth, calculated arc. NST programmed 3 distinct drift styles: canned, artistic, and one-touch. Each one changes the slip angle threshold of the car. In our 60 frames per second footage, watch the transition from the straightaway into a hairpin turn. There's a specific frame where the weight shifts, a moment of digital's weightlessness that NST perfected. It's why this game feels more elastic and responsive than almost any other racer on the system. It's not just a visual treat, it's a masterclass in 64-bit physics programming. Now, we have to talk about the N64's secret weapon, the 4 controller ports. Ridge Racer 64 featured a 4-player split-screen mode that was, frankly, a miracle of optimization. Normally, when you split the screen 4 ways, the N64's resolution drops through the floor, and the frame rate usually follows it. But NST used a clever dynamic resolution trick. By simplifying the background geometry during multiplayer, they kept the game playable. This is where our 1440p upscale becomes a game changer for the modern era. On a CRT in the year 2000, 4-player split screen was a blurry mess of 16 pixels per car. But running that same code through our current pipeline, the game becomes a legitimate modern party racer. We're finally seeing the detail in the opponent's cars that was originally hidden by the hardware limitations. It proves that the code was always high quality, the hardware was just the bottleneck. So, we've seen what they could do with a Namco license, but who exactly were the wizards at NST? Nintendo Software Technology wasn't just a random satellite office, they were a handpicked team of specialists designed to bridge the gap between Western technical grit and Japanese design philosophy. After Ridge Racer 64, this team became the special ops unit for Nintendo. They were the ones trusted to launch the GameCube with Wave Race, Blue Storm, a game that still has some of the most impressive water physics in history, and later, the high-altitude technical showcase of 1080 Avalanche. When you play Ridge Racer 64 in 1440p today, you can see the foundations of that future. The way they managed the N64's memory was so efficient that Nintendo later tasked them with developing the Metroid Prime Hunter's engine on the DS, a handheld that had no business running a 3D shooter that well. NST were the masters of the impossible port. They looked at hardware limitations not as walls, but as puzzles. Ridge Racer 64 was their first major statement, a proof of concept that a Western team could handle a quintessentially Japanese arcade franchise and, in some ways, technically outclass the original creators. So, what is the final verdict for our 2026 retrospective? In a world where we're obsessed with remakes and remasters, Ridge Racer 64 stands as a testament to the power of clean code. By pushing this to 1440p and capturing it in 4K, we've essentially performed a digital archaeological dig. We've stripped away the fog and the blur of the year 2000 to find a racing game that is mathematically perfect. It lacks the wobble of the PlayStation and the mud of early N64 titles. It might not have the cult classic J-pop soul of Type 4, but as a piece of software engineering, it is arguably the most stable, high-performance racer of the entire 64-bit generation. If you have the means to run this in high resolution, it ceases to be a retro game and becomes a high-speed time machine to an era where developers had to be geniuses just to get the car to stay on the track. "12 minutes later, and I think it's clear, Ridge Racer 64 isn't just a forgotten sequel. It's a technical masterpiece that was simply born at the wrong time. I'm Brian, and this has been No Drama Llama Gaming. We've got plenty more technical deep dives coming your way as we continue to push the 32 and 64-bit eras to their absolute limits. If you enjoyed this trip through NST's history, hit that subscribe button and join the herd. I'll see you on the next track. Always bet on the drift.